Welcome, everyone, to the Dr. DC podcast. My name is Dr. DC. Producer Richard is in Japan right now, so it's just little old me. Each week, we talk about the weird and wonderful world of DC while fielding questions from listeners like you. And this week, I'm very, very pleased to have a pair of guests. One, an old friend, one that you know from listening to the show, one brand new, both academics, both big comic dorks like me. Very excited to have Matthew Poulter and Andrew Deman on the show today.
Thanks for having me back. Oh, all right, we're talking over each other. Okay, Andrew, go ahead.
I just said hi, thank you.
Perfect, great.
I was going to say, and you know what? For once, Richard is not here to introduce me as Chicken Matty. So you know what? Suck it, Richard.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard, but we also, I think you're almost ready for the promotion. We came up with a new character. His name is Turkey Steve.
Yes, I remember Turkey Steve.
We might get there. No, thank you both for joining. Really excited to have you both on. You're both academics. You have different fields of study, but you're both really into comics. Matt, I know you and and on the show, we've talked about how you got into comics and how it's kind of connected to your research interests. But Andrew, for you, are these two things coincidences, or is there something about how into comics you were that kind of led you down an academic path?
Yeah, and Matt can attest to this, but like academia, if you're not interested in what you do, you're dead.
Sure.
Like, who would endure that if it's not something you absolutely love?
Yeah.
So I was in American poetry. I got really bored of it, and I liked comics, and I was like, do you guys think I can study comics? And my supervisors were like, oh, sure. So I did. And that became my career in life.
Interesting. So for those who don't know, at home, you are the lead person behind the Claremont Run, project, which lots of people may have encountered online, especially our listeners might have seen that online. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I feel like I shouldn't, because he was a Marvel career man, but he did write like a couple things for DC. I shot a project studying Chris Claremont's X-Men. The book came out on Tuesday, and we're, I think, currently number 2 on Amazon for, graphic novel and comics literary criticism.
That's awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So what is it about Chris Claremont or about even the X-Men that, what is it that you find the most interesting or find the most kind of like fertile research ground in? Okay.
Well, I know I'm talking to people with theater backgrounds. Claremont identifies as a method writer.
Right.
He was a theater major. He couldn't get work as an actor. So what he did was he decided to bring that mentality to comics. So the depth of his characters, it's just based in that method approach. He was psychotic about character voice and consistency.
Right.
And it makes it really fun to study just because there's so much depth there innately because he took that approach.
Totally. I mean, it's kind of funny when we talk about stuff like that, especially when it comes to serialized comics, because other than maybe some broad stroke things, we don't necessarily have a lot of examples of really specific, voice quirks for a character. There's lots of examples of like Lois Lane always wears purple, or, Superman's got the spit curl. There's lots of examples of visual cues. But other than Constantine, saying like in it or something like that, there's not necessarily like a ton of like language, cues that way. So it's kind of interesting that that's sort of Claremont's like one of his big contributions to it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Trying to create these distinctive, I don't know what the word is for it. Not iconographic, but when you take like a sound and you represent it with a visual association. He was doing a lot of that. These weird phonetic accents that are really overblown. But charming if you're nerdy enough.
Now, Matt, we've talked about, I know a lot of your kind of comic interests we tend to overlap when we get into like the 80s, if we're talking about, Dark Knight Returns, or like we're talking today, Watchmen, or things like that. I know there's a lot of overlap for us, there, but generally speaking, what would you say are the things that get you really hooked on a comic? Are there new comics that have managed to scratch the itch of some of these classic things that you and I like to touch base on?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, like, I have a really disparate background when it comes to comics because, I mean, for a long time, I was more interested in like comic adjacent media, like I think like most children of the 90s, I grew up on like the cartoon adaptations of plenty of this stuff. So, I mean, like Batman, the animated series is effectively like my forever touchstone when it comes to superheroes and the like. But right. I mean, like, so from a young age, though, I still I liked comic book art. And I mean, if you want to talk about a golden age for excellent comic book art, I mean, the 80s is clearly one of them. My girlfriend is currently reading through like the George Perez run of Wonder Woman, and she like absolutely adores the art and the like. And, but like nowadays as well, I mean, like there's just beautiful stuff coming out in superheroes and just in comics in general. I mean, like that's a thing that's ever pressing forward. But on top of that, I think like, and especially kind of getting to our topic of discussion for this week, I mean, I think, a lot of what we think of when it comes to superhero comics is like ensemble casts. And I like a good ensemble cast. Like, I mean, that's what I loved about the X-Men cartoon in the 90s. Sure. And like, when people talk Batman, the Rogues, for instance, like, saying out there, cause like Batman is my favorite and has forever been my favorite. And like the Rogues gallery is always what comes up. And like, there's a character for everybody out there. And like, even if it's just a random, like one-off who's just been there, like just the one time or a couple of times around and stuff, you could just be like, oh man, this character's rad. Like I remember watching the Justice League Dark animated feature and messaging you and going like, so Etrigan the Demon, like, where do I learn more about this guy? Because I'm into this. So I think that's what really draws me into it, is just like you get these great casts of characters that can really play off of each other. And that's, again, like, I think that's as omnipresent in comics as it's ever been. Like, there are aggressively few comics that really are like one character ventures. And I mean, they're out there, but I think that's what really draws me into it is just like, regardless of your taste, there is a character for you.
Yeah, totally. Now, Andrew, I've got to ask, because it's a DC podcast, who's your DC like go-to? Like, do you have one? Do you have a couple? Who's your person?
So this is fighting words at the wrong convention. I wouldn't say character based because I do jump around characters a little bit.
Sure.
But I really like Tom King. Even when he's not succeeding, I love how big his swings are.
Right.
Like Heroes in Crisis is a train wreck. But I enjoyed reading it as a train wreck. Like, just what he was trying to do was so cool. It just didn't come together. But like his Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, I really liked his Batman run. I know a lot of people didn't. The extended Batman and Catwoman, obviously Mr. Miracle. He kind of goes back to the same idea a lot.
Yeah.
But it's a good idea. And it's got some nuance to it.
And it's funny, when you think of, going back to similar wells or things like that, and you just see like, well, why do some hit and some miss? And sometimes I mean, this is not a particularly, good assessment, but I do feel like sometimes it's just the idea manages to line up with a character better than other times. Sometimes it really feels like we're cramming people into unnatural positions to make a thing work, whereas other times it feels like it should always have been that way for them. Like Mr. Miracle feels like that's like a glove fit, right? And then I kind of look at something like right now, Danger Street, and I go like, like maybe, I don't know. Tom King's definitely, he's become a sort of, oddly polarizing figure. He's like, he's a good writer, but it is kind of funny how the works really divide people.
it's funny you bring this up because like I feel like Andrew's comment here is almost in direct response to like I guested on Andrew's podcast recently in which I directly shit talked Tom King's writing on Batman. Like directly, and it's one of those things where like if I have to give credit to the man, it's like, you know what, I actually like I enjoyed the Batman and Selina stuff throughout that because I think that definitely is working into his niche, like his Mr. Miracle and the like, and it really was like the rest of the ensemble cast that I honestly thought was a bit of a letdown. Right. In that run. So it's a case of like, you know, I'm not going to go out there and be like, he's history's greatest monster or anything. Like he's, you know, the man's got his strong points, and it's just a case of I'm like, you know, I think, and Doc, you said that you didn't think this was that eloquent of a point or something, or that strong of a point, but I think that's a very good point in the sense that it's like, you know, you can take someone who has a real knack for certain kinds of storytelling, and as soon as you take them outside of that comfort zone, like it gets mixed. Like there are authors I adore who I read almost everything they put out that like I've read some of their runs and I was like, this is the wrong person to get on this run.
Right.
Maybe in support of Matt's point, I do want to point out that my favorite thing in Tom King's run where he let me down was, it was Tom King. And I'm like, okay, we're going to get a cerebral Batman. We're going to get a Batman from somebody who knows about espionage. And then there's the scene where Batman has to storm Bane's fortress. And he just, Leroy fucking Jenkins.
Yeah,
he just like runs at the bullets as fast as he can. And I'm just like, yeah, I've seen this before.
I mean, that's a very good point. Somehow that's never been my issue with the King run of Batman, but now it's going to be, I'm sure. That's really funny. So we should get to it. We're talking about Watchmen, this week. Now, Matt, I reached out to you because I was like, Matt's my boy when it comes to 80s DC. I know he'll be like on side. And then Matt, you were like, I need to bring Andrew in on this. Do you want to talk a little bit about where that came from and how we're all connected by Watchmen here today?
So, I mean, like, there's no two ways about it. It's really direct. Andrew is the reason I read Watchmen, because here I was, an undergrad student in my first year of university in 2007, and you know, I sign up for this course in the English department called Science Fiction Literature, which I'm like, I like all of those things. And I start in this class, you know, I see it's taught by a guy, Andrew Deman, and I look him up on Rate My Professors, because of course I do. And everyone's like, oh, this guy's great. And like his subjects are really interesting. And I'm like, all right. And I get in, and like, sure enough, it's a great class. You know, we're reading like War of the Worlds, like Asimov's Foundation. We read William Gibson's Neuromancer, which, you know, to this day is like one of my all-time favorite books. You've already had me on to talk about cyberpunk before, and like again, like we're seeing some of the origins of that here too. But for the section specifically on post-humanist science fiction, we're assigned an Alan Moore graphic novel called Watchmen, which at the time I was not a big comic guy in general. Like I'd kind of been out of the zeitgeist of it for, you know, pretty much most of my life, if I'm being honest. I was never in the zeitgeist at that point. But I'd obviously heard of it. Like, you know, it's got that really iconic cover that you see all the time in bookstores, like even if you haven't. But anyway, no. So I have this prof who says like, yeah, I generally assign an Alan Moore graphic novel in almost every one of my courses, and for this one we're doing Watchmen. So sure enough, I read it, and I definitely remember a lot. I remember a lot of the class discussions on it, I'd say, more than some of the other discussions on some of the other courses, and or on the other texts, I should say. And in fact, like Andrew, I asked our good friend here a question that you asked our class back when I took it that I still remember. And there's another one coming up that I have saved aside that I also still remember from it that I'm curious to get into when we talk about it. But it was like, you know, so suffice it to say, like, I would not have read this comic as early on as I did, and probably gotten the depth of knowledge that I did of it if it wasn't for the other person guesting on this podcast, which is why when you approached me, I was like, okay, like on the off chance that he's available, like I know exactly who I need to talk to about this.
So Andrew, then for you, what's your first exposure to Watchmen?
So when I was in my PhD program and I wanted to study comics literature, I had been out of comics for about 10 years. So there was a lot of catch up, the background reading and learning what's been written about different comics at the time. And it just kept coming up. Watchmen, you got to read Watchmen. Watchmen is the best comic, and on and on and on. And I went in skeptically and I read it, and then I went online and I started doing the wormhole thing. And just my God, the level of detail is horrifying. The amount of thought that went into this book that was regarded as disposable pop art, is, a testament to the genius of Moore and Gibbons. Mm-hmm. And it became one of my favorites. And I think one of the things that led it to the course was just how teachable it is, right, because of that depth, because of the density of the thoughts that are in this book's brain collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we should just hop in. We got a ton of questions. I'm going to be skipping a bunch because there's not enough time to do the volume of questions that came in about Watchmen.
You mean to tell me that people have thoughts and feelings and questions about Watchmen? I'm shocked.
People have thoughts and feelings about Watchmen, and I've been trying to edit some of them down. We'll see how this goes. So, first question, we're going to Facebook. Do
you want me to do the song that you?
Oh my God, did? Please, yeah, do it.
Go to the face, said the book. Go to the Facebook.
Thank you, Matt. This question comes from Kyle Sovey, who asks, "Has this comic affected the way you read other comics now? First time I read the book, I thought it was fine, and then I got suggested to watch a Kieran Gillen video dissecting Watchmen, and it completely changed my way of reading comics. Easily in my top 5 now." So for both of you, did the experience of reading Watchmen or going back and kind of analyzing it, how does that change how you read comics post Watchmen?
I mean,
go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, I'll start us off as the sort of like, I guess, the more neophyte of the group. But, I mean, like I said, when I first read it, I did not have the background of knowledge that I did at the time. So when I first read it, like, I hate to reveal this, Andrew, but like, I much like our question asker, I also thought it was fine. Like, it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I don't entirely know that I understand why it's as acclaimed as it is, but I also I like a lot of it. But afterwards, when I started doing like the deep dives into like the big, storylines of the same time period and and especially after like once things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe really started getting off the ground and I started to see some of the reflexivity that really, that Watchmen really banks off of, kind of started making its way into popular discourse. I was like, oh, okay. Like, this is definitely something that, like, in many ways, it very much was ahead of its time. Just in the sense of, like, there's so much, there's so much that it comments on that, like, is still very relevant to today, not just politically, but even just in terms of, like, our, the deconstruction of our views of superheroes and the like. And I mean, full disclosure, I reread it today after getting the call to do this, and like I will say it was quick. I didn't pay as much attention to it as I could have, but like again, I think it's definitely one of those ones that like if you read it and then go read a bunch of other comics and then read it again, it's very much like, oh shit, okay, like yeah, they had their finger on the pulse of like this industry like decades ago.
Totally.
Yeah, I'm similar boat. I think the way it changed my reading of comics was it raised the bar, which is kind of an obvious conclusion.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. But the idea that you could have this sort of, again, popular medium, that you could operate within that at a depth of philosophy that was far beyond the expectations of it. Like pick an element of this book. Its quantum physics are really tight, especially by 1986. Like this is the many worlds interpretation. This is decoherence. All the Schrodinger's cat stuff is in here. The geopolitics. And then wrapped in all of this is a beautiful and kind of loving satire of superhero comics. Like it's pointing out all the problems, all the entrenched sort of patterns in superhero comics, but it's not making fun of them. It loves superhero comics. It wants to make them better. And it absolutely did in the aftermath of this thing being published.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's funny. I mean, I admittedly probably came to Watchmen relatively late. It's not something that I read growing up or in high school, or really, I'd probably not even in university. I would have been like in my mid to late 20s by the time I read Watchmen. I probably, this is an even crazier thing to admit, I probably read it after I saw the movie. But I think the thing that really got me at that point, and probably with the context of seeing it after the movie, is how it uses the comic medium. You know, there's all those extra supplements, the government documents, the files, photographs, all these other pieces that are part of the reading experience. The whole extra layer of the pirate story. You know, like all of those other pieces. And so I think for me, similar to what you guys have said, I was like, oh, okay, this isn't just like reading Batman. I'm reading something that is like endeavoring to elevate a thing that is generally considered to be a little lesser of an art. I'm being reductive about it, but you know what I mean? Like, so I do think I read it and I was like, oh shit, okay, well, like, I understand why it has a claim in that. And then I do think it took me a few goes through to understand, like, like the story itself. I don't think I got it right away because there's too many pieces, too many layers. I think every time I read it, I had to go through with an eye on something else because, it's just too dense, I think.
Well, and it's kind of funny you highlight all the extra layers of stuff to it, like the government documents and the excerpt from the autobiography, and then the Curse of the Black Freighter, and the like. And I definitely remember that my first time reading this as an impatient 18-year-old. Like, those were probably my least favorite parts of the book.
Sure, right.
Just sitting there going like, oh my God, like, get on with it already. And you know, I have some issues with Moore's prose in general that maybe we'll get into at some point on this. Maybe we don't. And not just in this book, but I mean in general, like as a writer. But, you know, even just today, as I was like speeding through this whole thing, I was like, these are my favorite parts of the book. Like, just now I'm reading like the sections of like, oh, Hollis Mason's autobiography, and I'm just sitting there going like, God, I wish more comics had stuff like this.
Yeah.
Like, this level of world building that is like in a completely different style of prose and a completely, like, you know, almost entirely non-visual and stuff, and yet gives you such a great insight into the history of the world without like it's so direct, and yet somehow it doesn't feel preachy or condescending or anything like that. It's genuine world and lore building in a way that's like that actually accentuates the story. It's just like I said, nowadays, you know, like in my 30s, I read this and I'm just like, oh, like this is the best stuff in the book. Like, by far.
Totally. I mean, I'm a guy who loves like the appendices of Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. But you,
and again, like as a teenager, but I do now.
But that's also that's like getting like raw materials. That's like getting like ore out of the ground. Whereas like Watchmen, like you said, when you're putting it in the context of like we're writing this like an autobiography or doing stuff like that, you're getting like a more refined version of world building than just like, I also thought of this thing and just putting it like out there, you know?
Yeah, that was the thing that really caught me off guard, especially was like just how seamlessly it integrates into it, just despite the fact that it's like completely different writing style and different genre at time as well. Like again, just something I did not appreciate enough the first read through.
Totally. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question here. This one is a slightly weird one, but I think it bears as much discussion as we can offer for it. So
you calling your listeners weird there, Doc?
Yes. So we're heading
Not
on over.
Wrong, I'm one of them, but still
heading over to Threads. Threads, and over there, Ty Jarris asked, "What, if any, is /R a good sequel to the original? For my money, the HBO series hit the nail on the head." So. For the purposes of this, there are kind of three, I would say, main prong sequels to Watchmen, and they kind of all occupy a slightly different, their own kind of universe. So One is the HBO miniseries from just a couple years ago. One is the Rorschach 12-issue series from Tom King. And then the third one is maybe the most direct, or another direct sequel is Doomsday Clock, which is what blends Watchmen and the main DC universe together. There's sort of three like entirely different versions of sequelizing Watchmen. I don't know how familiar we all are with all of them, but are there any just thoughts right away about the idea of sequelizing Watchmen?
No, please don't. I think it was my immediate reaction.
Sure.
And that's not a knock on the artist, because holy crap, the Watchmen HBO series is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
For me, Watchmen's power is in the idea of indeterminacy, the way that ending hovers.
Right.
The way the heroes are all gone. They're either dead, they're corrupt, or they're the bad guys now. You know what I mean? That's so evocative and powerful. So to me, revisiting that narrative and picking up those threads, I just don't want to see it. But that's hypocritical because, as I said, I loved the HBO series.
Sure. But I mean, there, would you say then that there's an element where no matter how good the thing is, you're kind of like fundamentally undermining Watchmen just by doing it, even if you do a great job?
Yeah. I want to take the cranky Alan Moore perspective.
Right.
There's more stories to be told in that universe because you made a good universe, right?
Yeah.
But please don't.
Yeah. Fair enough. Matt, do you have any like thoughts or experience with any of these kind of prongs at all?
So this is where I have to give the confession of like I have not interacted with any of the other stuff. Like I've been kept up to date with the broad strokes of the plots of the Rorschach series and of Doomsday Clock. Like I have a vague idea of what goes on in those. I still have not watched the HBO show. It's on, as I texted you earlier today and said like it's on my to watch list. That's a mile long.
Sure, yeah.
But kind of listening to what Andrew just said, I can draw a parallel if nothing else, which like is tangentially related. I was listening to someone discuss basically all of the post original trilogy stuff about Star Wars.
Okay.
And which I know is a contentious topic online as it is, so I'm not going to get too deep into the woods on this one. But I listened to someone refer to like specifically talking about like the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy being the things like the main things they were discussing. And they happened to summarize the prequel trilogy as good ideas executed poorly, and then discussed the sequel trilogy as bad ideas executed well.
Sure.
I like that.
Sure.
Yeah. And so like for me, that was revelatory because I was like, yes, like this is what I've been trying to say in far less eloquent ways for years.
Right.
And I think that when you were asking, like, is there this inherent like issue of like sequelizing Watchmen to some degree? I think that's kind of where even my reluctance to read that, like, let alone interact with any of the other series, because I was like massively skeptical of all of it, even the HBO series, even after hearing about how good it was. And I like Watchmen's not even my favorite comic. Like I'm not anywhere near invested in it as some people are, but I think there may be some inherent notion of like any sequelizing of it, as Andrew said, like it very well might inherently be like a bad idea that can be executed well.
Yeah. I mean, kind of on that note, I feel like I should be the one to talk a little bit about Doomsday Clock.
Please do, because you've brought it up to me before, and it's a thing I've definitely found fascinating, while also at the same time being like, I have no desire at all to read this.
Well, totally. So, and the very, very short kind of context piece of that is that for those listening, is that in 2011, DC rebooted their whole line as the New 52, which saw a bunch of histories of characters change or get shortened. A bunch of characters were missing. All sorts of stuff happened, but it was supposed to be a new jumping on point for people. And admittedly, it was.
And everyone
succeeded in that.
Got mad at all.
But a lot of people got mad about it, as you might imagine, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, as with all of these serialized things, they go, can we get the best of both worlds? Keep the stuff that we like from the New 52, but bring back the history, all of the stuff from beforehand. And part of the narrative device of what happened to the universe and these people and this missing time was that Dr. Manhattan did it. So Doomsday Clock was sort of the capstone of a few things that teased that this is what had happened. Doomsday Clock is 12 issues. It's very much aesthetically meant to follow up and evoke Watchmen, and it's the collision of the Watchmen universe and those characters with the DC universe and those characters. I think, to Matt's point, I think it is a bad idea done very well. I really like Doomsday Clock. It's a really compelling read. I think some of the ideas in it are really cool. I like the way that they incorporate different corners of the DC universe, even like pulpy things like Nathaniel Dusk, the private detective, or, bringing a sort of Dr. Manhattan's prismatic view of time. They use that to reintroduce both the Justice Society and the Legion of Superheroes in that story. There's a really awesome way that they center everything on Superman and Superman's importance to DC. It's very meta, obviously, but all of that stuff I think is done extremely well, and it's really, really captivating to read. But if you asked me why Ozymandias is there, or why the comedian is there, or why it had to be Dr. Manhattan at all, I'd go, yeah. That is clearly just, that is such a more kind of craven idea that then was, they did the best possible version of something with this very craven idea. But it's not, I don't think Doomsday Clock saves the idea of, why is Dr. Manhattan messing with DC? It's just the best possible version of, if we say that is true, let's deal with it. And I think that's kind of what Doomsday Clock ends up being, for me at least.
I have to admit, you know what? That has been the most compelling description I've gotten of it. And you know what? Putting it that way, I can't speak for the other listeners, but I'm like, you know what? After hearing that, I would give it a chance.
I think if you just take it for what it is, it's a very enjoyable read. But if you're going in this better live up to Watchmen, then you're in for a bad time,
I mean, I feel like that's so true about trying to do anything that even remotely touches on a sacred cow, quite like
totally.
Watchmen. Yeah. I mean, even I'm firmly of the opinion that if you did any even closely tied thing to this, even another straightforward adaptation, and let's say it was an adaptation that got everything in the book 100% right. Let's say, I don't know, if the HBO series had just been a 1-to-1 recreation of the comic with all the dialogue perfectly intact, all the shots perfectly intact and everything, I think there are people who would still hate it.
Yeah, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. All right, let's move on. We're going over to Instagram. Now we're going to Instagram, take some questions and answer them. So much weirder without Richard when I have to lead myself into a thing. All right. So this first question comes from Mara in Iowa, who says, "Woo boy. Everyone always says Watchmen is a must-read, so I gave it a try. I didn't even make it halfway through. I know it's of its time, but geez, I want to appreciate it, as I think you can learn and grow from reading things you don't like or agree with, but it was hard to get through what I did. What advice do you have for folks like me who want to appreciate or understand the work, but cannot get past how much they dislike all the characters?"
I would say, for one thing, you're supposed to dislike the characters, sure. And that's a hard sell.
Yeah.
Please come not enjoy the people you're spending time with.
Right.
What I recommend to people who are a little cold on Watchmen going in, because it is a slog. There's no way around that. First read of Watchmen is a slog.
Yeah.
I think it's actually good to just go onto YouTube and look at some videos about why it's brilliant and spoil it a little bit for yourself.
Right.
Because that'll at least help you get through it and you can go back and appreciate it. But as we've already intimated, most people who love Watchmen didn't like it on the first read.
Sure.
And that's a really weird way to try and sell a book.
Yeah. And I think it's totally fair too. And I mean, there's also the ultimate point of you liking it and appreciating it are not the same thing. I think you can get through it, and maybe, you know, even on your fourth pass through, you might just make up your mind you don't like it, which I think is a completely fair thing. But once you're on your fourth pass through, you might find little things that you appreciate in it. The way it handles a particular character, or the way it uses a sort of kind of multimedia or sort of, interdisciplinary kind of writing or things like that. You might find a thing that you latch onto, even though you're like, I wish this was in a different book. Like,
Well, and to kind of jump off your multimedia point, I mean, like me speaking as a film guy, largely in terms of my background, like a parallel I could kind of draw to that, and one that Andrew and I have talked about as well, actually, is Blade Runner, which is a movie that, like, I've had so many people come up to me and be like, I watched it for the first time and I didn't like it. Like, what did I do wrong? And I'm like, I'm going to tell you straight up, like, the first time I watched it, I didn't like it either. Or at least I'd say I didn't say I disliked it, but I was kind of sitting there going like, really, that was it?
Sure.
And every subsequent watch after that was better, to the point that I was in like a film class at one point watching it for what I think was probably the fifth time I had seen it at that point. And I was getting excited when certain parts were coming up, and that really expanded on it. And Watchmen, I think, certainly is a similar thing. And like Andrew already said, but I'm going to completely just piggyback off that and say, like, yes, you're absolutely not supposed to like the characters.
Right.
And,
yes. Yeah.
Like, I get the sense the whole time that, like, no, this is all written by someone who absolutely does not like these characters. And, like, I love media like that personally. Like, I absolutely relish having to put myself in the shoes of someone I find reprehensible.
Right.
And, like, I also understand that that's not how people necessarily want to use their leisure time.
Sure.
Because sometimes you just want to read a nice, fun comic about, like, the bad guys getting their comeuppance and stuff. But I mean, what I think I only appreciated about this more, again, as I read it again, and especially today, was the timelessness of some of the characters, even if you don't like their, like, way of thinking, and even if this is set in, like, a period long past at this point. And more so than that, like, the fact that, like, almost every character in this book, I would argue, and I'm sure someone will take me to task over this, but every character in this has a point at some point.
Right.
Like, they are not, no one is completely perfect. No one is completely imperfect. Like, there were, we may end up getting into it depending on some of the questions, but there were characters that came up even in my most recent read where I was like, I am legitimately shocked at how much more I find myself, if not relating to this character, then at least kind of being like, you know what? Like, I kind of understand where they're coming from. And,
right.
You know, I think it's also the kind of thing too that, like, to kind of say, like, advice for it, I would honestly say watch the movie.
Yeah.
Like, as much as that's a contentious topic, and I know a lot of people are very understandably not fans of it, it gets, I think, enough of the broad strokes about what makes the story interesting, right? Even if it doesn't take them to the same place.
Right.
That I would kind of feel like it's a good kind of, like, it's almost like watching an abridged series of, like, a long-running series, something or other. Like, it's a good montage of, like, key moments to get the over-encompassing thing and kind of be like, okay, if any of this resonated with you at all, then there's a chance you'll probably enjoy the comic. Whereas, like, if you straight up hated every second of the movie, I'm like, well, it depends on why, right? Like, if you found the movie kind of vapid, then I'd be like, well, the comic's that, but much more intelligently written and done in a much more intricate way. But if you were just like, no, I just don't like this, and I'd be like, you know what, maybe you just don't like it, and that's totally fine. That's not a bad thing. Like, we reevaluate, you know, sacred texts all the time when it comes to media and everything, and just because, like, a generation of people are saying, like, this is one of the greatest achievements in this medium, which it is, I would agree, but it's like, that doesn't mean it has to be for you. It doesn't mean you have to like it.
Well, I mean, you know, Richard and I talk about this a lot on this show. We didn't coin this phrase, but we use the term museum pieces a lot. Yeah. Where we're talking about things that have impact and legacy, and their influence is undeniable, but they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily hold up to the same scrutiny, or because the way we consume media or perspectives on social issues or things have changed, the thing doesn't age especially well. You know, Frank Miller always comes up anytime we talk about museum pieces, you know, a real key piece. But so does Alan Moore, you know, like The Killing Joke. It has been reevaluated many times, even by Moore, who expressed his own regret at some of his artistic decisions for that, So I think it's totally fine to get through Watchmen and go, not for me. But it's a different lens to go through and say, and I see what it did to comics, there's kind of separate ideas, all right. Moving on. Got a question here from Jeff Attack. And Jeff Attack asks, if the story was done with the Charlton Comics characters, as was originally planned by Moore, what impact do you think that would have had on the DC universe of today? So, we've talked about this on the show before, but the initial pitch was DC had only just basically acquired the rights to the Charlton Action characters. So Blue Beetle, Nightshade, Captain Atom, Peacemaker, Question. And the plan was to use those characters, and DC was like, what are you going to do with them? And Moore went, and they went, no, we just bought them. So, so we ended up with all of these analog characters instead for Watchmen. I know it's hard to do this kind of speculative thing, but what do you think might have been the impact of that? Like, would Watchmen be less effective using recognizable characters like that, or?
My gut reaction is to say yes. I think I don't know if it hits quite the same way if it's done with a cast of people that I recognize. And I think to some extent, like, now maybe it does in like the comic book circles and the like, but I think maybe part of what gets this potentially nominated for a Hugo and, kind of keeps it so in constant discussion at the time is that, like, it is a book about superheroes, but it's not about any existing superheroes.
Right.
And I think I think maybe it doesn't catch on with the public at large in quite the same way that it does over the years and clearly critically if it uses existing characters. Because then, like, the problem with rooting anything in any existing franchise and any existing, like, universe sort of thing is that, like, now you've got constraints. Now you've got an audience. Like, you've partially got a baked in audience who already knows those characters, but then you've also got an audience that's like, well, I don't know any of the history behind any of these characters that they're using, and it's intimidating. Like, I've spoken at length in some conference pieces and the like that I've done about, like, just the difficulty of getting into superhero comics as a medium. And I know you guys have talked about that as well. And I think I would be willing to bet that it doesn't necessarily become the same cultural phenomenon if it isn't, like, a whole new group of people that's like, it's a blank slate going into it. Like, you don't need to know any of these characters because there's nothing to know.
I mean, the Charlton characters were never as, like, massive as, characters from Marvel or DC. But to your point about constraints, I wonder if, I don't want to keep putting this guy on blast, but I wonder if we'd end up with a sort of Tom King scenario where the story ends up feeling a little more forced when we're using these templates of established pieces. Whereas even though the Watchmen characters are, like, very obvious analogs, they're not, like, cleverly disguised or anything. It's just that much more freedom to do the story the way the story needs to be told. And you don't have to worry about, like, well, Captain Atom wouldn't do that, or, like, or kind of considerations like that.
Yeah, I think there's a subjectivity piece too, because I agree with Matt. I think the accessibility of the story might be lost a little bit.
Right.
And as you said, there's that burden of continuity, but at the same time, I really like when Alan Moore dives into an existing lore.
Sure.
This is the guy who ended Superman. You know what I mean? The first time. This is the guy who wrote For the Man Who Has Everything. This is the guy who wrote The Killing Joke. Mm-hmm. He can play with that mythology. He can play with your expectations, and that might create an emotional investment in the characters beyond the new characters. But I don't know. To me, it's horse trading, right? I think you gain something and you lose something.
Yeah. Totally agree. All right. I should just throw out there. I don't know, if either of you have read this, but there's a sort of interesting, like, snake eating its own tail thing that's happened to DC now, where, Earth 4 in the DC multiverse is the world where the Charlton characters existed, and Grant Morrison's take on Earth 4 is basically to like Watchmen Earth 4. So now like Watchmen's inspired by Charlton, and then Watchmen goes on to inspire this kind of Charlton-y version that is different enough, but clearly very, inspired by or whatever. It's a very odd thing. There's a book called Pax Americana. It's a single issue. It's an interesting read. It's an interesting little piece of kind of like riffing on Watchmen without, like we've been talking about, without sequelizing it or anything like that. But, it is kind of weird through the looking glass kind of shit to see the Peacemaker and be like, well, that's the comedian. But you go like, wait a minute, the comedian's Peacemaker.
How did I know Morrison was going to come up at some point in this episode? Like just I could feel it in my bones.
I usually find a way to bring Morrison up at some point.
Yeah, he's my own Black Freighter, effectively, is what I'm saying.
I love them. I love their work. It was going to happen at some point.
Oh, there, right. God, now I feel like an idiot.
I mess it up constantly too. Okay. Next question here. Slightly controversial, but Matt's already touched on it a little bit, and I would love to dive in a little. So Blake von Sextron, asks, great name, by the way. I don't know if it's a real name or not, but I love it.
I don't care. My headcanon is it is.
They ask, how does someone like Zack Snyder so thoroughly miss the mark? So slightly leading question here, but, when we're talking about the movie as an adaptation of this work, what are your perspectives? What do you think works about it? What do you think doesn't work? Was this a doomed prospect from the beginning? Like, where do you think the movie hits or misses?
So I'll start off by saying, like, I'm an apologist for the movie and have been effectively since it came out. Like, I even remember being in another of Andrew's classes, like, discussing with him, like, my generally positive reception to the film.
Sure.
And it's one of those cases where, like a lot of adaptations of Moore's work, you know, in a lot of ways, it really does the subject matter a disservice. And I mean, Doc, you and I have had our discussions about Snyder in particular, who is like a filmmaker that I think I'm ultimately more warm than cold on, even though, like, generally I think he misses the mark quite a bit, but at the same time, like, he does it so earnestly that I can't help but, like, appreciate it on some level.
Yeah.
And I guess what I would say is that, like, because I've been talking this whole podcast about, like, you know, experiencing the book much later and so on and so forth, like, this is going to be a very backhanded compliment, in the sense that I think Snyder's movie, to a large extent, especially the theatrical cut, because I do think the director's cut actually improves it quite a bit. And I would actually recommend to someone that if they have only seen if they only saw the theatrical cut in theaters, I would actually say check out the director's cut, because I think it gets a little bit more right that time around. But to me, it's very much like, it's the Watchmen movie I would have made when I was 18.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's got, like, the cool Rorschach monologues and, like, the slow motion and the absolute baller soundtrack. Like,
sure.
Between the licensed music and the Tyler Bates score behind it, which, like, I still listen to that score regularly. Like, the kind of electronic piece that plays when Rorschach's going to visit the comedian's grave, like, that's, like, ingrained in my brain because I just love it. And, you know, it's like, it's got so much of the aesthetics right, and it's like, it really is at times, like, seeing, like, the pages come to life, and in that regard it's incredible. But, you know, it's like I said, it's like, that's kind of the way I approach that movie, is like, this is the Watchmen I would have made as a teenager.
Right.
And, you know, on the one hand, I can't begrudge someone making the movie that maybe they would have wanted of this as a teenager, but at the same time, it's like, maybe someone on the project needed to take a step back and be like, okay, like, who are we actually trying to appeal to here with this movie? And in some respect, that kind of also gets back to my point from before, where I do think this was a project that was doomed to, like, make a ton of people unhappy, regardless of how it came out. Like, again, I very firmly believe that if the movie was 6 hours long and included absolutely everything from the book just verbatim, people would still find a reason to hate it.
Sure.
And like, probably rightfully so. Like, I'm not saying that to condemn people's opinions either, but I don't know. It's, like I said, to me, it's a product of what it is. And I think there's redeeming aspects of it, even if I can concede ultimately that, like, yeah, it's maybe not the adaptation of it that should have been made.
Sure. Andrew, what do you think? As someone that, teaches Watchmen as a literary piece, when you go and look at this at this adaptation, what are your kind of like immediate thoughts? We know that, no adaptation is going to get everything, but what are your big takeaways from the Snyder movie?
I think when you're a fan of a book and a movie's coming out, one of the visceral thrills is kind of what Matt said, just seeing a scene or a character brought to life.
Right.
And I thought the movie crushed that in a few key instances. I would really point out Billy Crudup as Dr. Manhattan and the Dr. Manhattan scene in particular.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. In terms of where it fell flat, and again, it may have been doomed from this or on this note from the get-go, but I don't think it had the layers of irony. You know what I mean? It played it very straight. And it was like, I'm going to have Night Owl fight a bunch of people in the prison and it's going to look awesome. Yeah. And it's not supposed to. You know what I mean? He's supposed to have a beer gut and be looking kind of silly in his tights.
Right.
So no, I think it got sucked up into the whole superhero-ness of it all, possibly by studio interference. Who knows? And that diluted its message quite a bit for me.
Yeah. I mean, I actually feel, to Matt's point about Zack Snyder's earnestness, it is a thing I like about Snyder. I mean, it's not I'm not newly saying that I like Snyder. I generally I think he's a great, aesthetic filmmaker. I really like, in general, his approach, but it is undeniable to say that he is a dude that, misses the point. He makes a really great thing, just 3 degrees off of where you think it should be, and I think Watchmen is one of he's, Moore's own words are people come up to me and say, "Oh, I love Rorschach." I'm so he's get away from me. That's fucked up. And I think Snyder is one of those guys where he's yeah, you read Watchmen. He's this is cool as shit. And to that layer of irony piece that you're talking about, it's just, there's one more bit of it that doesn't make it into Snyder's vision of it. So you do get these really cool visuals and really kind of haunting music and some great casting and some like the whole opening sequence, with Blake fighting Ozymandias and stuff like that is really good, but it's also done isn't this the coolest fight you've ever seen? And it's not just a brutal pulp murder the way it is, in the book. And so there is this other layer of what if everything was cool on top of it, and it's missing the point, which is that none of it is cool. Yeah. And so I do actually like watching the movie, but on a fundamental level, the movie is doing the wrong thing with the book.
And the unfortunate thing about that too is that because I was extolling the virtues just a second ago of the director's cut, but the fact that if you watch the director's cut, it includes the scene of the original Night Owl trying to fight off the group of gangsters that end up killing him,
right?
And flashing back to fighting the super villains at the time, sort of thing. And that sequence in the director's cut is one that again, go look it up on YouTube or something if you haven't seen it. And that to me was almost the closest something like that got to getting it right.
Right.
Because the coolness of that is entirely in the character's head. It does cut back to reality. And he gets a good hit or two on some of them, showing off that this old guy still kind of got it, but he still gets overwhelmed and brutally murdered.
Right.
And and that was that was a moment where I was God, it sucks that got relegated to the home video release. Cause there are moments that got removed where I'm sitting there going I'd almost be tempted to guess at studio interference, like Andrew mentioned, because it's there are parts where I was you know what? He almost got it. He almost gets it.
But isn't that just classic Snyder though too? Man of Steel, he almost gets it. If you look at Man of Steel, the way that they talked about it on all the press tours was we're making a First Contact movie and we're, he's unsure. We're taking a lot of stuff from, the Byrne era Superman where he wasn't Superboy. He's coming to it late and he's got all this doubt and all this kind of stuff. It's so close. And then it kind of we go into if two of these beings punched each other really hard, how much damage would it cause? And you go like, well, that's not really as important as this character stuff over here. It gets a little diverted from the point, right? That feels like the classic Snyder problem, right?
Again, it's the Superman movie I would have made as an 18-year-old.
Right.
It absolutely was. And I still, you and I have talked about this before, and I'm sure we need to move to another question, but I still love Joe Hill, writer extraordinaire and son of Stephen King, and his point about Man of Steel that he made once on Twitter, which was that he said, like, the trailer for Man of Steel is the single best adaptation of Superman ever.
Yes.
Like, that one trailer with, like, the swelling music and all of the key scenes from the movies. Like, that is that 1 3-minute trailer is the single most perfect Superman origin story ever recorded. And I was like, that's so true.
Similarly, I think the 3.5 minute BVS trailer is the best version of that movie.
Yeah.
Like that trailer, I'm like, yeah, great. You nailed it. Moving on. All right. Let's go over to Reddit, where everyone's nice and no one's ever mean. And I've got a question here from Eldritch Slut.
Ooh.
I love our listeners.
I just threw just yesterday, or no, sorry, 2 days ago, I threw a D&D themed bachelor party for a friend of mine. And this has given me some flashbacks. So,
I love that.
Please go on.
So on some of these notes that we've already been discussing, how the hell did Moore accurately predict what the average conservative would be like in the 2020s? Also, just a small, simple question here. Conservatives idolize folks like the Punisher, Rorschach, Tyler Durden, etc., and everyone in Starship Troopers. Why?
Man, again, I got to jump in here because like reading it today and again, for the first time in the better part of a decade, I was just thinking back on I was one of those late teenagers, early 20-somethings who thought Rorschach was the best character in this whole thing.
Sure.
And I'm reading it now and I was just like, this guy sounds like fucking Alex Jones. Right. I could not get over just how every line of dialogue he has is I've heard this screamed by a lunatic on some kind of adjacent social media sort of thing. And I was like, God, I was hoping someone was going to ask a question like this because it hit me so hard on this reread. And I think I was actually talking to someone else about it, and I think part of it, and I think the movie to some extent plays a role in this because as we just discussed, it tries real hard to make everything cool, and especially Rorschach. And I mean, Snyder in particular really loves his Ayn Rand and his whole perspective on that. He's been trying to make a Fountainhead movie for years, if I've heard correctly.
Right.
Which, God, I don't have enough time or crayons to explain to people why this is terrible. But I think part of the problem is that, and this is the thing I even point to with the irregular story, is that my point before about how almost every character has a point. Rorschach to a large extent gets it right in terms of the general plot. He figures it out right away.
Right.
He's nope, someone's doing this to superheroes. And then he goes on, he's like, yep, someone got Manhattan to leave the Earth. This is deliberate. This is going on and stuff. And for how much of a whack job the guy is, he is the one at the end of the day who knows what's going on and no one's listening to him. And I could see it really kind of feeding into that, conservative persecution fantasy that they really have. Of we're the ones who know how everything actually works and no one ever listens to us because everyone's too busy being woke or something like that. And it's right. It's that kind of unfortunate thing where it's like that Onion headline where it's the worst person you know just made a valid point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Andrew, what's your take on this? Because obviously there's sort of as pointed out in the question, there's sort of a long history of these kind of ironic or satirical or critical characters being taken at face value with all of the layers of criticism stripped away. What's your take on that?
I think a lot of it comes from basic pattern analysis. Moore saw the rise of Thatcherism in England, and he knew how that sort of trend goes, and then he saw Reaganism taking over in the US of A. So For him, it was a case of history repeating itself, and that sense of frustration and doom and inability to stop it. And if you ever want to see him write about it really directly, you got V for Vendetta, which is about Thatcherism, and you got what I think is his best work that nobody talks about enough because it's largely been hard to get in print until recently is his work on Captain Britain, which is fantastic and very much about the rise of a political power based on a pre-established trajectory, and you can't stop it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what is the... If Moore himself positions Rorschach as the sort of like insane extreme, the stuff that is scary about a Question type or a Batman type or a whatever type of character, then is there something kind of muddied in the idea that Matt brought up, which is like, but he's right? Like he did it? Like he solved it? Like is there a baked in mixed message that it's all like you almost shouldn't be surprised that people connect to Rorschach, or is there another layer there that I'm missing as well? Cause it almost feels like if that's how you feel about that character, there should be something in there that shows that it's wrong, or that they missed a thing. Like they should have missed something fundamental, but ultimately he's the one with like the moral code. He won't lie. He won't he's the hero, even though he's insane and awful, you know?
Well, the comparison that I would go to from a literary standpoint, and Matt may or may not agree with me on this, is Satan in Paradise Lost.
Yep.
And the reason he's a good devil is because he's a compelling one. Because he is tempting, because he makes sense, and because he has heroic elements to his character.
Right.
Rorschach has to be appealing, right? You have to want to be a little bit like Rorschach in order for it to really hit home why that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I like the Paradise Lost analogy, actually, and that makes total sense. And it's interesting. So to kind of segue into something, Doc, when you and I were texting, I sent you a text that was actually, I didn't reveal it at the time, or I might have said it actually, but Andrew, this is a question you asked my class when you taught us this book. And it was a question, I see you laughing, you people can't see that, but like you may remember this, but it was a question of who is the protagonist of Watchmen? And I remember our class, like, debating about it, discussing it and everything, because you took votes. Like, you wrote down, like, a bunch of the different characters, and, like, people voted in on it. And, like, overwhelmingly, the vote was for Rorschach.
Yeah.
As the protagonist, which is a thing that, like, I still remember your reaction to this day. And, like, at the time, I was kind of like, wait, really? Like, that's so bad? And then, like, now I'm reading the book again, and I'm just like, oh, now I understand why he's horrified by that prospect. But... like, kind of owing back to that, like, I agree in the sense that he has to be compelling, and to some extent, like, you have to root for him, even as you're acknowledging that he's not worth rooting for. And I think that's where, because to comment more directly on the question that this person asked, I think with any discussion of stuff like this, there's always an element of media literacy that comes into this. And this is a thing that, like, the programs I've studied have been fortunate to, like, really push. In the sense of that, like, okay, you know, not only understanding the message that an author is trying to convey, but also, like, being able to acknowledge that, like, depiction is not necessarily condoning, but then also the danger that can be shown in depiction. An example I always go back to, and I'm doing a lot of tangents on this podcast, so apologies, but I remember the reaction to The Wolf of Wall Street when that came out. And a lot of some critics and just a lot of public reactions in general saying that movie does not do enough to show that Jordan Belfort is a bad person and that you shouldn't be like him.
Right.
And I definitely remember a lot of responses in the end saying that, like, if you need that explained to you, like, you're the problem.
Right.
But at the same time, I was going to say, I generally agree with that statement. Like, it is the kind of thing. But at the same time, you know, you have no control over who is going to consume this piece of media. And the, like, people who are maybe not as, like, literate in terms of media criticism or media analysis, or people who are just generally impressionable in some way, shape, or form. And I think everybody is impressionable in some way. There's the possibility that someone is going to interpret it the exact opposite way that you intended. And unfortunately, that's ever present, and we can discuss all the live long day. Like, does that mean you need to moralize in your book? Like, do you need to have a big sprawling piece of text explaining why Rorschach is not someone to be emulated and whatnot. And I don't know what the answer to that is kind of the ultimate thing here. But in terms of like, again, why do conservatives love the guy and like these other characters and the like? Again, I think it's they see it as someone who like espouses their worldview and is ultimately in most way, shape, and form in terms of the story, like is kind of right.
Right. Yeah, it's the ultimate justification. Everyone tells me I'm wrong, but I've seen through the curtain or whatever. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And what I find really interesting, and I noticed this on this read, is like how much Rorschach kind of goes on about how the comedian understood things, because that's so fascinating to me, because like the comedian is just like the absolute epitome of like just of nihilism, like of the absolute just abandonment of meaning, because like he's someone who like worked behind the scenes, saw how the sausage was made, and it broke him. Like the stuff that Rorschach is idolizing, Blake is spending a bunch of time going on like, this is all bullshit.
Just to add to that, Matt, if you trace it, literally every of the main superheroes in Watchmen expresses admiration for the comedian at some point in that book.
Yeah, well, and it is interesting too to have, Rorschach, this clearly like very unhinged sort of individual, is still in a way clinging to an ideal, right? And to your point, the comedian abandoned that. But when you get to the end of the book and you kind of reflect on the thing, I'm not talking about individual actions, because obviously there's some horrifying things that happen in Watchmen, but the comedian almost has the more reasonable worldview than Rorschach, because Rorschach has this kind of like blind fight sort of thing. And maybe there's something commendable in that in a way. They certainly make it a bit more heroic at the end where he won't tell the lie. But like you look at the comedian and he just gives up and starts drinking and, stuff like that, and be like, yeah, what else would you do? Like he actually feels a lot more human than Rorschach. Again, their individual actions and violences aside.
Yeah.
There's something very kind of disturbing about looking at the comedian and being like, yeah, like that's kind of super messed up. I think that's maybe the part of the thing that I really like about Watchmen is you get to the end of it and you go like, oh, are we all bad? And you're like, oh no. Like even, Dan Dreiberg, right? Like he's supposed to be the most, quote, stereotypically super heroic of them all. And he's so pathetic. He's like, everything about him is sad and, washed up or sold out or all of those things. The only thing of Night Owl that feels heroic is, Hollis Mason, and he fucking dies, it's kind of crazy to get to the end of the book and you go like, maybe all of us are bad. All right. I'm going to move on to the Docscord and just a couple of questions here. So question number 1 comes from Jaffe, and he just asks, he asks a very simple question, but it's a very difficult question, but I'd be curious what people say here. How justified is Alan Moore? That is the entire question. So, Moore has very specific feelings about Watchmen. What's everyone's take on Moore? Because, admittedly, Dave Gibbons has also had some pretty specific things to say about DC and about Watchmen, about, all of the sort of disagreements therein. But Gibbons has also said, I wish people luck as they're working on stuff. When before Watchmen, when those books were coming out, he was like, I hope the creative teams do a good job. Go for it. He's like, I'm not going to read it, but like, go for it. But Moore has a much more kind of ardent position. So what's our take on Moore?
I think I feel a bit sort of like his daughter felt. His daughter publicly stated during his retirement that what people don't understand about her dad is that he's not a miserable old crank who hates comics. He fucking loves comics.
Yeah.
And that's why he's sad, because the industry broke his heart despite how much he brought to it.
Yeah.
So I think Moore is incredibly justified. DC did some really shitty things to him particularly, but to a lot of creators in general.
Totally.
I mean, once again, drawing parallels today, I think it's that ever-present, like, question from creatives, right? Like, about just, like, the ownership of your own art, the way people choose to use it, the way people choose to monetize it, the way industries spring up surrounding it, like, whether you wanted it or not. And one that I always go back to, I'm teaching a course on kind of the history of Japanese animation in a few months. And one that I always go back to is Hayao Miyazaki, who is, for those who don't know, is like one of the main directors of Studio Ghibli. So he, did like My Neighbor Totoro, Castle in the Sky, Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, like all the big ones that, like, even if you're not an anime lover, like, these films. And they're these whimsical, like, life-affirming, like, genuinely, like, beautiful inside and out movies from a guy who has a reputation as, like, a complete and total curmudgeon. Right. And if you watch, like, any commentary he has, he just, like, the dude seems like the unhappiest man in the world. And a comment that he makes at one point that kind of gets bandied around a lot online as a meme, which I still find funny to this day. In fact, I have a t-shirt with this quote on it. Is him kind of discussing the present day anime industry, and he says anime was a mistake, it's nothing but trash. And,
wow.
People take that a certain way, and what's kind of out of context with that is that he's talking about, like, a lot of present day, or then present day, because this is an older quote, but then present day trends going on in the industry, and a lot of things like particular bits of trend chasing and trying to capitalize on, certain movements and whatnot. And I think that him and Moore, in some ways, are very kindred spirits, circling back to Moore finally, in the sense that I think, as Andrew said, his daughter almost certainly has the right of it, is that this is not someone who got into a medium to, like, make a quick buck. This is someone who cares so damn much that it ruins them when they see things that they've created kind of taking this direction that they are just sort of fundamentally opposed to. Yeah. And especially, like, to comment on what Andrew said about, like, DC doing plenty of shitty things, and especially to him in particular. I mean, like I'm firmly on Moore's side in terms of him speaking on, like, his regrets about The Killing Joke, which, is a story that still gets recommended to people as, like, essential reading for Batman to this day, but also contains, like, some very divisive and frankly just kind of horrifying ideas that, like, even he himself says, like, he didn't want to do it at the time and should have listened to the signs saying that he didn't want to. But on the other side, to kind of round out this point, like, I do have a bit of respect for the Dave Gibbons side of things as well, in the sense that it's like, it's one thing to be jaded and have gone through the experiences that you have, but I don't think that necessarily means, like Moore can sometimes, I think, come across as, like, kind of dragging people down with him, whether he means to or not. And I don't think he does mean it, but at the same time, it's like Gibbons, I think, is at least able to, like, separate that bitterness or any, like, regrets he may have with it from him wanting people to find success in the same medium and to evolve the medium and to appreciate his work and the like. So I don't know, like how justified is Alan Moore? I think he's got a lot of valid reasons for feeling the way that he does. At the same time, I'm kind of like, I say the same thing to, I've had people ask me about, like, things that maybe I've regretted doing or something like that, but I'd be like, hey, you know what? Like, if you try it and you work it and it works out for you better than I do, like, that's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, I almost feel like the bigger issue here is that people need to stop fucking bugging Alan Moore about a thing that has clearly, like, devastated him, like, really broke his heart, hurt his feelings, made him angry, all this stuff. Like, every time there's they're writing before Watchmen, are you going to read it? Like, don't be fucking stupid. Of course he's not. Like, why do we keep pestering Alan Moore about, it's like, it would be like every time Gwyneth Paltrow dates somebody, we go back to Brad Pitt and we go like, hey, how do you feel about, or like whatever, like some version of that. Like, hey, do you want to think about what happened like 7 X's ago again? Like, it's so dumb. It's such a, I mean, we could go off on a whole other tangent about like, kind of like comic or nerd news and how that kind of stuff, like it's so, everything's so speculative and everything's like in one interview, someone said, I think it'd be fun. They go, they want this to happen. Like there's no sense of like literacy or like anything like that about like media reporting when it comes to any of these kind of things anymore. But the idea that anytime something is happening with Watchmen, be like, should we go ask Alan Moore, see if his mind changed? It's like, just leave him the fuck alone. Like, like I feel like that's the bigger issue because Moore is also like a very fundamentally like, I think like unfiltered kind of honest person. He's not going to give a like, and I wish them all the best kind of thing if that's not what he feels, So now we're just poking the bear to see if it bears its teeth. And it's like that, like, of course, like, what do you think is going to happen? So I agree with what's been said, but also that idea of him being the curmudgeon is like, we did this, like, like.
Well, and like I was gonna say, like this, I loved the point you made about like geek culture and like geek reporting in general, because like this is a thing that keeps happening to so many degrees. It's like, I remember when like Roger Ebert commented that like video games are not art in the same way that movies are, and I'm like, okay, anyone who knows anything knows he's clearly wrong.
Yes.
Like he's very clearly like someone who is like set in his ways and everything, and that's fine. He earned the right that he had to be a crusty old man who didn't understand the youths. But like people kept bringing it up, being like, "Oh, if you played like Shadow of the Colossus, or you're gonna play like The Last of Us," and so I'm like, "Leave the man the fuck alone.
Yeah.
You're not gonna change his opinion on this at this point." And similarly, like I think the closest equivalent I see in the modern day is like, people keep bugging Scorsese about his like opinions on superhero movies, and I'm like, who the fuck cares if he doesn't like them?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
The man made Goodfellas. He can think whatever he wants about whatever. He thinks The Exorcist 2 is better than the first one. Like, that tells me all I need to know about Martin Scorsese's opinions on certain movies. But at the same time, it's like, he already said what he thinks. He gave valid reasoning behind it, whether we agree with him or not. And it's like, so it's exactly like you said, like, quit poking the fucking bear at this point.
I also feel like that there's another piece to this, which is, and we don't always know where these things come from or the genesis points or what is an editorial thing versus what is kind of creator driven or whatever. But I think there's a big gulf between the intent and the effort of the people working on it, to the Dave Gibbons point, which is like, to the creative teams before Watchmen, go for it, versus DC as an entity going, should we do a bunch of Watchmen prequels? Like that is one layer of it. The people working on them, I have very little doubt of their earnest intention to make something worthy of the thing they're doing a prequel of. But that's a separate thing from DC as a publishing entity going, we should make a bunch of prequels. And I think Alan Moore was even quoted as saying, like, it's very obvious they have no other options, no other creativity or things like that. Now, Moore's not saying no one out there is creative. He's not saying it about the creative teams. He's saying it about the corporate entity, right? And I think that's the other piece of it too, is no matter how good a thing is, if it comes from this place of the IP well, going back to the IP well, I think there's something fundamentally kind of sour about it, right?
Yeah.
All right. We've got one more question here. So this question comes from the Moral Compass of the Dockscored, who asks, what themes or critiques would a reader pick up more had they read Watchmen for the first time, having already been steeped in superhero comics? So more talking about the tropey things that we reference, or the things that we're kind of rebutting in Watchmen or deconstructing. What are some of the key ones that you think, if we're just talking about maybe just a first read through, what are the kind of the key ones that you might have an advantage if you were already sort of steeped in the world of more traditional superhero comics, and then you jump into Watchmen?
I think there's a lot of direct references to specific superheroes. Matt would know this as well, but like Dr. Manhattan is Superman. He doesn't have the same power set, but it's very much about Superman's relationship to humankind.
Right.
Night Owl is very clearly Batman. Right. And more sort of mouthpiece to talk about Batman. And then the one that I always got really frustrated with in teaching Watchmen was actually the feminist subtext in it, where people are like, Watchmen's anti-feminist because Silk Spectre is exploited. That is the point. That superheroines are exploited and turned into sexual objects through a progressive process that they internalize. It's incisive. It's quite astute.
Right.
But people kind of miss that because maybe they're not too familiar with the sort of entrenched gender perspectives that we get in a lot of superhero comics.
Right.
So I think that would come out a lot more clearly.
Yeah. I mean, you're speaking about Night Owl as a Batman character. I mean, there might be some people listening to this who maybe think of Rorschach as more of the Batman character. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you view Night Owl and what's Night Owl's critique of Batman? Because I think some of the more kind of like grimier, tougher things, we see them in Rorschach, but what's your view of Night Owl as a Batman analog?
That Batman is in it for the kink, basically.
Right.
Moore has said this. Like this was a sexual interpretation of the superhero, and you have this character. Like, it's a really simple question: why would a man dress up in a leather bat costume and go punch people? Well, obviously for sexual purposes. There's no other valid reason to do that.
Right.
And the story like really clearly goes in that direction. And again, Matt will remember this, but if you look at the scene with him and Laurie trying to have the most domestic sex ever.
Right.
The Netflix and chill of this era, watching TV on the couch.
Right.
He is literally impotent from, I think it's 7 p.m. to 2 a.m.
Right.
And they just keep trying. But he immediately then goes downstairs to his cave, puts on his bat costume, goes around, does some superhero stuff with the superheroine, and all of a sudden they're having the best sex of his life. Right. You know what I mean? Like, it's really clearly there if you start to trace the lines, which I think is kind of
I was going to say complete with a Leonard Cohen song in the background in the movie.
Hallelujah. Yeah.
I mean, Snyder has an aesthetic. There's what, 2 or 3 Nick Cave songs in the Justice League. So, I find that interesting. Matt, what's some of your perspective on what does being a superhero fan maybe give you when you jump into Watchmen?
I think it's to kind of piggyback both off the Night Owl point and even what you were saying about like people seeing Rorschach as a Batman analog. I think both of those are completely correct. And I think therein is kind of one of those things of that, like what a lot of people, I think, especially like a lot of non-comic fans struggle with is this idea of like different interpretations of the same character.
Right.
And we're seeing, the film universe is having to grapple with this recently, like this idea that can be like there can be multiple versions of Spider-Man, there can be multiple versions of Batman, so on and so forth, and like which is interesting because I find like a lot of audiences are like in some sense they are kind of receptive to it, but at the same time it's like yes, like Night Owl and Rorschach are almost like two sides of the same coin. They're even partners at one point during their glory days, so to speak.
Right. And
it's this idea of that, like you've got different interpretations of Batman that all have different criticism levied at them. I mean, Watchmen's during kind of the same era that The Dark Knight Returns become such a huge thing, and like Frank Miller's Batman is not the same as like the Neil Adams Batman or something like that, and as such, like it's almost like the different interpretations of this one character. And I think that kind of also speaks to that point of people like misinterpreting kind of the point behind some of these characters, in the sense that like that lack of literacy of not just on the commentary, but also the fact of like, yes, there are multiple versions of these characters that have some through lines, but are also very drastically different, to the point that you have to wonder that like if these two versions of that character met each other, like would they even be able to cooperate? And I think some stories have actually done pretty good jobs of like kind of interpreting that. Like I still for however much Flashpoint gets its knocks as well, like I find their interpretation of like Thomas Wayne as Batman really interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Just in the sense of like, what happens if it's the dad that survives as opposed to the child, and the like. And so like I could definitely see like the confusion some people might have, in the sense of like, well, like Rorschach's obviously the Batman, especially like in this day and age when we live with like the shadow of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, the like most darkly serious, like unfunny takes on these. looming so large in popular culture, even though we've also like live in the era where like the Lego Batman movie is a thing. So I don't know. I think
it's funny when you bring up that people are, like, you know, like the temperature in general is that people are more or less okay with the idea of different versions of things, because, you know, the example you gave is Spider-Man. And I'm not going to talk for people that are like deeply entrenched in the comics, but if we're talking about like sort of general populace, people taking in the movies, but maybe who haven't read too much of the other stuff, I would almost argue it's like we're okay with the idea that Spider-Man exists in multiple worlds, but are we actually okay with the idea of different interpretations of the character? Because I think fundamentally, if you look at Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland Spider-Man, while there are obvious some difference in their performances in that, are they vastly different characters? And I'd say no. And look at the last 3 Batmen that we've had, the Nolan one, Batfleck, and Robert Pattinson. The tone of those movies is a little bit different, movie to movie, not vastly, but a little bit. But really, they're all Batman, dark parents, you know, like all that kind of, like, no parents, all that kind of shit. Like, we haven't really crossed the bridge of someone doing a newer, fun Batman. Like, something more like the Schumacher one, or more like whatever. And like, really dealing with it in the context of the dark Batman or whatever.
Yeah.
We haven't crossed that bridge at all. So I'd not to be like, not to start a fight, but I'd actually say like, we're not ready for that as like a general populace. That idea of multiple interpretations, I think, is foreign. So I think it's interesting then to have something like the Blue Beetle question relationship, which is, you know, Night Owl and Rorschach, where they kind of are, you go like, wait, which of you is Batman? And I think for a lot of people, they might just look at it that way and not necessarily have the context for like, well, they each are in their own way at different times, sometimes, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I think the main example I was kind of thinking of as in sort of like gauging people's readiness, for lack of a better term, of different interpretations is Spider-Verse. I think that might be kind of
that's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah. That might be the closest we've gotten in the sense of like that sort of thing. But I also agree in the sense of like, if you were to do like Into the Bat-verse, like how different would most of those interpretations really be?
Yeah. They're so close, you know?
Yeah. Like you have like Adam West and George Clooney just chilling off to one side and be like, I'm not doing none of this shit. Are you kidding me? And then like the rest of them are just having a dark off sort of thing. And yeah.
I know I said that was the last question, but there's one more, and somewhat selfishly, it's because there's a thing I haven't talked about that I just want to give a little shout out to, but I'm hoping we could still have a little bit of a discussion on it. So the last question comes from JK, who writes, of all the sequels or prequels or whatever set in the Watchmen universe, which do you like the best, and have any of them contributed anything profound or worthwhile to the canon? So we're talking about this idea that Matt, you crystallized the idea of like, were any of these good ideas, even done poorly, as opposed to bad ideas done well? The one I wanted to mention, I said before Watchmen, DC did this kind of series of sort of mini-series comics that were, some of them are prequels, some of them are like, like the bookend piece is set like during Watchmen. Like the Ozymandias one is like, it's the 35 minutes ago, but as he's doing it, he's reflecting back on a past adventure and that kind of thing. The only one of those that I felt like added a layer that was really missing. Well, not even missing. That's the wrong word, but added a layer that I think made me appreciate Watchmen even more is the Dr. Manhattan one. And the idea of that 4-issue miniseries is that Dr. Manhattan wasn't always, neutral. He would change things. He saw time prismatically and he would act, but it starts this sort of spiraling, you know, kind of multiverse, chaotic kind of quantum, snowball effect. And he kind of realized he has a responsibility to not interfere. He's too powerful. He he's concerned about his impact on like the fabric of like quantum reality if he's not sort of more passive. And I liked that just, you know, as a kind of exploration of those things. It did feel like a piece of his character that would still exist before he's a little more removed from humanity. That idea of like, well, I should obviously do something. And that part of what removes him from humanity is even his own experience, right? Something a little bit more internal. I liked that. I thought it worked. I thought it was interesting. That's the closest I've got to an answer to this, because even the other things that I really, really like, I don't know that I necessarily think they, you know, like fill in a gap, or, you know what I mean? Like I'm always looking at them as they're great versions of a thing that didn't have to happen, you know? So, do either of you have anything like that? Something that you've seen or that you've taken and you're like, do you know what? That actually does kind of reflect or retroactively add something to Watchmen.
Do you have one, Matt?
I mean, again, coming at this from the perspective of like someone who hasn't engaged with a lot of these directly, I do like the point that you just brought up in the sense that, you know, a lot of people will always want some more background on some of the things that they enjoy and just on what makes some of the characters they like tick. And Manhattan is probably one of the ones that, like, again, even if it's not needed, like that is a potential detail that I could see that serving the story in some way, because I mean, like, that kind of almost puts him as like almost a parallel to the comedian, like we already said, where like, and I think the book, like Watchmen on its own, definitely like hints at that, with Andrew, you commenting that like everyone expressing some admiration for him in some way, shape, or form. But again, these are both characters that are like that in some way, shape, and form are able to see a side of things that most people are not, and it just destroys any sense of humanity they have in various degrees. You know, I think everyone will agree, like one of the best scenes in the comic is when the comedian shoots the woman in Vietnam, which like that part's not fun. But like Manhattan's like, you just did that, and he's like, you could have stopped me at any second, and you didn't. Like that whole point is like that's just a key moment that like lands like that. And so the stuff you're talking about with Manhattan, like I can see that being like a fun little addition in that sense. I've also definitely heard, like, again, I haven't watched it yet, but I've definitely seen a lot of really excellent commentary on the HBO series, just in the sense that like the issues that it tackles and like the subject matter that it tackles is the kind of thing that like, okay, did Watchmen necessarily need this to be as relevant today as it ever was? Not necessarily, but there are also always going to be audiences that are maybe a little more receptive to, or maybe able to have an easier time comprehending something shown to them visually in motion, as opposed to something from reading an incredibly dense, you know, multi-page graphic text at this point.
Totally.
So I think it's one of those things that, like, you know, back on the discussion of like, did any of these need to happen? Like, no, not necessarily. But I would also, I guess I give like the kind of cop-out answer of like, hey, if someone appreciated the text more because they interacted with any of these things, then to some extent there is a net good there, even if it is, you know, like it's kind of the same way I feel about like the Star Wars sequels, you know, it's
totally,
like, again, like if we're going to take those as the definition of like bad ideas done well, you know, at the end of the day, if someone enjoyed the franchise that much more and found something else to like bolster their life because it really resonated with them, like, who am I to say that's wrong? But
totally. And I feel the need to qualify here. I probably shouldn't, but it's like, I really like that HBO show. I'm just not sure that I feel like when I watch it, I don't go like, oh my God, that we needed that. Watchmen was leading us there and I missed it. But when I watch it, I go like, if you're doing this anyway, this is the best version of you doing this thing. Like, I'm glad this is what came out of it, you know?
Yeah, I'd rather you didn't, but at least if you're gonna, like, it could be a hell of a lot worse. Yeah.
Sure. Andrew, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, Matt already touched on it, and you just kind of mentioned it as well. For me, like, I have a defensiveness around Watchmen. My headcanon will not let other things in. And as I said, I love the HBO show. The thing that I do want to absorb into Watchmen canon, is Hooded Justice.
Sure.
From the HBO series. It was a fantastic episode. And it brought in
I've seen some of it. Like, I was just gonna say, I've seen some of that, even though I haven't watched the show. And like even just the snippets I've seen as a as someone on the outside looking in, like, yeah, please go on.
Oh, I just gotta say, just because Watchmen to me is largely a story about America, and yes, It's created by a couple British guys, but whatever.
Sure.
I think bringing that key racial element, I think that adds so much to it, and really enriches the universe in my eyes.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I mean that's maybe one of the standout episodes of TV, certainly in my kind of recent memory. But yeah, I mean I think that version of Hooded Justice has a lot more depth than what's just present in Watchmen, which is kind of, I don't know, almost more like a kind of flippant joke on like, quote, sexual deviancy or unquote. But yeah, totally agree. That's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. That would be a great thing to kind of fold in and keep in the canon of Watchmen. Yeah. Excellent.
It kind of reminds me of again, to go back to the Star Wars discussion for a little bit. It reminded me of how, like, you know, something like the movie Solo is it ends up being like just kind of a resounding failure in so many ways because for a multitude of reasons, but among other things, like an overwhelming commentary from people is that like, this is not a character we needed more about. Like this character is already part of pop culture history and we didn't need it. Whereas some of the side shows have been infinitely more successful, and not just because of their better execution, but because it is showing an aspect of that world that we didn't know about.
Right.
And I think the parallel there with characters like Hooded Justice, or even like, again, the possibility of original characters in that universe is like, I think that's the kind of thing that if they wanted to like add to it, for lack of a better term, that would be infinitely more interesting.
And it's probably one of the smartest moves of that HBO show is not, I mean, there are some Watchmen characters in it, right? Ozymandias is in it. Laurie's in it. Manhattan is in it. But the show is largely about other people populating that world, which is probably one of the smarter moves they could have done. And, you know, putting that kind of distance too, because it's set like modern day. So it puts it like 35 years after, the events of Watchmen, also gives it a distance where you don't have to like immediately like pick up like 2 years after New York. Like we see a little bit of it, right? Like we see the squid monster. I do want to give a shout out to the show because I will say I watched the Snyder movie and I was like, this ending makes more sense. Like framing Manhattan. I was like, I kind of like this ending. I like that adaptation. And then I watched the HBO show and I was like, oh shit, you can make the mind squid work. And I was like, okay, well shit, you know, that's pretty good. Thank you both so much for joining to talk about Watchmen. This was a ton of fun for me. Matt and Andrew, now is a good time to plug your stuff. Let people know where they can find you, where they can engage, talk about your book, talk about your podcast. It's plugs time.
So I'll go first just because mine are quick. If you want to follow me on socials, you can find me at the Overmat on just about every platform. It's like the Overlord except my name. I'm going to be sending the doc a link to. So I've given some talks at some comics related conferences, largely talking about manga and cyberpunk and the like. But if you like comics and you liked at all the idea of hearing me talk about comics more, you can do that in video form. So I'll have some of those linked up. And I recently, again, guested on Andrew's podcast that I'll let him pitch, but that was also a very good time, and it's full of very interesting people, far smarter than I am. So if you want to hear them talk more about comics, like, by all means do so. So with that, I'll throw it over to Andrew.
Matt was awesome on that podcast, which is Gosh Golly Wow, which is about the Marvel comic series Excalibur. And I have a book out called The Claremont Run, Subverting Gender in the X-Men, which is about subverting gender in the X-Men. I'm very faithful to my title.
I mean, listen, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but it's a thing that I love about academic publications. You know what you're getting. Thank you both so much for making time to talk about Watchmen. This was a lot of fun for me, and everyone listening at home, you know where to find me. Dr. DC Podcast on all of the social media. Sign up for Patreon. We've got extra stuff there, including Bonding Time, where me and Mrs. DC are going through every James Bond movie. And if you like how we talk about all this stuff, but you want to hear how we talk about hot guys on a hot show, go check out our other podcast, Ghostfacers, a Supernatural Rewatch. rewatch. We're partway through season 8 of the CW Supernatural right now. And Richard will be back from Japan next week. So that's it. Say goodbye, guys.
Thanks again for having me. This is always a pleasure. I'll go back to being a regular listener for now, but this is always a good time.
Thanks again. Adios.
This was a Brain Freeze podcast.